stories don't define you. How you tell them will. Hi, I'm Sarah Elkins, your host and chief story maker of Elkins Consulting. We share stories for many reasons, to persuade, to entertain, to connect. What we sometimes forget is the impact of the stories we tell ourselves. Whether you're sharing personal stories or business stories, how you share them makes a difference in how you remember them and in how you're perceived by the people you're interacting with. When you figure out which stories to share, difficult bosses and coworkers, successes, failures, the next step is to develop how you share them. Have you figured out your patterns, your roles in those successes, the discomfort and your challenges? In this series, you'll hear stories that will resonate with you. You'll nod your head in understanding, and then we'll dig into the lessons from each of those. How many times have you been sharing a story only to be interrupted by a person eager to share his own? When I'm working with clients on communication skills, I remind them to listen for understanding, not to respond. But during this podcast, I'm asking you to listen and consider your own related stories, to listen and consider which stories in your life might have impacted you in a similar way. My guest today is Charlotte Wittencamp, and we have been connected on LinkedIn, it must be 5 or 7 years now, probably. And so it's such a treat to get to interview you for this podcast, because so much of what we've talked about over the years in terms of how we view the world has to do with resilience, which fits into this series that I'm kind of working through. So before we get started into the theme, I'm going to ask you to share something about yourself that most people wouldn't know about you. And this is, something that wouldn't be on your LinkedIn profile, something not on your resume. And the reason I ask this question of every guest is to put some of your character in context for our listeners who are going to be hearing some more deep stories and get into a very personal conversation. And I like for our listeners to have a little context for who you are and your sense of humor before we jump into that level of knowledge. So what do you think? What can you share with us?
Well, what usually take people aback when I tell them is that one of my best friends is my husband's ex-wife.
Oh.
And, to the point where we have had Christmases together, and I've had her family visiting in my home, and I've been visiting her family with her not present. So it's a pretty unusual, unfortunately, relationship in that respect. And I wish more people would pick up on it, because it's a gift that keeps on giving.
Oh, that is interesting. I don't know a lot of people who could say that their best friend is their partner's ex-partner. I mean, that is definitely unique, but it also isn't terribly surprising to know this about you after I've known you for this long, just because I know how balanced you can be when it comes to understanding where people are coming from. So that makes sense. So just for our listeners' sake, you moved to the U.S. from Denmark?
That's right.
When was that?
In 1998.
Oh, so it's only 20 years or so.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I was an adult. I moved my family.
And what brought you to the U.S.?
I live in Silicon Valley, so what brought me here was the same that brings a lot of people to Silicon Valley, that somebody has decided to invent something, and you have to go there because, or at least back in the 90s, you had to go to Silicon Valley because entrepreneurship in the big parts of the rest of the world, and certainly in Denmark, was, if not frowned upon, then at least considered really, really odd.
Eccentric.
Yes.
Yes. I think in some cases it still is, but now it has this air of golden unicorn. So I think it's changed a bit. But I'm curious, did you go to school in Denmark for your professional degree, or where did you do your training?
I've actually been doing both education, on both sides of that transition. I had a bachelor's in economics with major in accounting and organizations development with me when I came, and then I took a degree, as a master's degree in organizational psychology here. in the US.
Okay. Well,
One
that's
reason
another
is
thing.
that, for a lot of people, the Copenhagen Business School is not something that rings a bell. Being going to a California school is sort of, that's just around the corner, right?
Right. It definitely gives you a different kind of credential.
It does.
When people hear that. Huh,
yes.
That's interesting.
And I also have the, I don't know, strange idea that if you do something that involves other people, you have a responsibility to know a little bit about what you're doing. So since organizational development is something that touches a lot of people on very, very central part of their life, their work life, you should have some idea what you're doing.
Oh, yes. If you're going to work in that area, that's a good idea. I'm glad you did that. So the reason I wanted to have you as a guest on the podcast is because I'm doing this series on resilience and starting with the basics of what makes a person resilient, how they see themselves in terms of resilience. And my friend Andy Amundsen was my guest. And I'm also getting into organizational resilience and personal career resilience. But what you were talking about when we started kind of playing around with this idea of this particular topic was more along the lines of how your stories can either hinder or help you when it comes to resilience. So when you think about your story, particularly, when you had a struggle, that pivot point in your life, maybe when you moved across from one country to another, then totally different language. Can you tell me about a specific time that you remember kind of acknowledging that fear and then overcoming it?
It was actually funny because I specifically remember the first time in my life when the idea that things were different moving to another place was driven home. And it was very, very mundane. I was, as a teenager, trying to send a postcard to a school friend when visiting a family in Switzerland. And it took me 3 trips to the town square to find the stupid mailbox. Because in my mind, a mailbox is hanging on the wall and is red. And Swiss mailboxes, at least at the time, were green. So I was probably looking at the stupid box, having no idea that this was a mailbox. And it ended up that the daughter of the house had to go with me to the town square to show me a mailbox. And it was really, just assume that you know nothing. So that sort of was kind of my first aha experience.
That is definitely an awakening. That realization that something that you would.
So it was eye-opening.
Something that you would think would be so basic.
Yeah.
That is not.
No, it's not.
Right.
And I was just reading the newspaper today, and they were talking about the bike routes in Copenhagen, which were raised a little from the pavement of the road, so that felt safer. And I'm sort of in my mind seeing the bike routes that I have been biking on my whole life, and they have never ever been any different. And just that this should be extraordinary enough to be mentioned in the New York Times. I'm like, that's interesting.
That is something that I find fascinating too, that something that we grow up with that we think is so common that catches the attention of somebody else. And you mentioned something about that when we were talking about what we know about ourselves versus what we don't know about ourselves, or what might be kind of a latent memory that we aren't really consciously aware versus what other people know about us and what other people don't know about us. You were talking about that structure. Can you talk about that again and kind of describe that for me?
Well, the structure is called your Harry's window. And it has this idea that there's some things I know about me that everybody else know about me, and my LinkedIn profile is quite obvious. Then there's things about me that people normally don't know about me, and shared the story at the beginning of the interview that people can't read on my LinkedIn profile. Then there's things that other people will see about me and that I don't know. And the impact I have on them, good or bad, is not something I would know unless they tell me. Just an example of where I belong in that square. And then finally, there are the things that I don't know and that other people don't know either, but may be provoked when you have deep conversations. And obviously for me, moving to a different culture, a lot of my cultural background came from that. I won't say that I don't know it, but it's not something that when you haven't traveled otherwise than as a tourist, it's not driven home to you how much your person is built within that culture that you have grown up in. People have moved a lot. I mean, America is a big country, so there's a lot of cultures in America. So I mean, Americans apparently move more happily than a lot of other people, at least, have done in the past. Mm-hmm. So I'm sure that you have a bit of that when you go off to college, or if you move 3 states over, even if you stay within the same country. But when you move to a different country that has different laws, and not only different laws but a different legal system, mm-hmm. Then there's a lot of things that you take for granted that you have to question everything you know. Mm-hmm. I can tell you it's very humiliating because, even intelligent people don't know that Swiss mailboxes are green unless they know them.
Right. And to have to ask, where's the mailbox? It can be humiliating. You feel like you shouldn't have to ask
humbling.
that.
Let's just say humbling is a better word for it. I mean, yeah, it could be humiliating as well, but it's definitely humbling because you're sort of getting a restart. Right. And it's a restart with, probably one leg is tied to the other.
Right. And that makes a lot of sense that you wouldn't necessarily know this about yourself, and other people may not know this about you until there's context for that question to be asked. So when you go to a child in the square, and you have to be humble to ask a question like, "I'm sorry, I don't know where the mailbox is because I don't know what your mailbox looks like." Yeah. And the child doesn't know this about you, that you're from Denmark, until you mention that you don't know what a mailbox looks like. Yeah. And of course, you don't know that you don't know what a mailbox looks like because you think you do, based on where you are.
That's what drove it home for me, really, was that I did not go to the town square twice. I went 3 times. So it did not occur to my host neither to tell me that what I was looking for. So to them, a mailbox was so self-evident that they didn't need to explain that a mailbox is, approximately the size and green, right?
Right. And for people who have never traveled, this looks like ignorance.
Yes.
For people who have never been in that position where they had to ask a question like, what does WC mean?
Yeah.
Then they can come across as very judgmental and laugh or make it humorous. And I've experienced that when I've had people come to the United States and have to ask a question, and I've heard others kind of tease them about not knowing.
Yeah.
And I'm always puzzled by that because this person, obviously, if they're teasing somebody, it's because they've never traveled to a place where they didn't speak the language.
So you mentioned one of the other things that are humbling, which is that you have to function in a foreign language. Mm-hmm. And apart from the accent, which in itself can be a distraction for people listening to you, then since you probably is not mastering the language to the same extent as the locals, it means that not only may you come across as less intelligent because your vocabulary is not as big as you would like it to be, but it also comes with the price of a lot of intellectual brain cycles that have to go into you speaking in a foreign language. Now, but I've been here for 20 years, so I'm sort of doing it automatically. But particularly in the beginning, there's a lot of effort being put into that. And then when I would say that because American culture is so everywhere, you're kind of exposed to American language and movies in many, many countries. But usually actors don't speak over one another the way that people in real life do. So you have to figure out not only do they take turns or not, and you also have to figure out, what are they actually saying when two people are talking at the same time?
When they're interrupting each other.
Yes.
So this actually leads right into our theme, this whole resilience. I find that people who have traveled a lot have a tendency to be more resilient, and not just resourceful, but resilient, where something unexpected occurs and they figure out a way to address it quickly and without it causing major emotional trauma for them. Have you noticed that?
I think that the people who stay, because a lot of people go back, there's very much a difference between if you're traveling somewhere and you have a known back end, like if you're on a 2-year expat assignment somewhere, you know that this is, this too shall pass. If you are a student on staying for a semester somewhere abroad, that too has a back end. When people have immigrated, and I will say probably even more for people who have been immigrated, as in refugees or people who may have traveled along but are this, unfortunately, this very, very condescending phrase that this is condescending. I don't even want to use my brain cycles on it. But spouses who have gone along with their expat partners, I would say they have been expated, right?
Right. Not necessarily by their choice.
Yeah, I would say it's their choice is to be with their partner, whatever it takes. And that's sometimes a very steep cliff. I've had people who, have, when they moved here a long time ago, started with taking the local telephone book and starting calling up people with names that sounded like they would be from back home because they knew nobody.
Oh,
yeah.
It sounds very lonely.
It can be extremely lonely. Now, thank God for Facebook in that respect. My hat's off for them, but that's an area where they have had a lot of positive influence.
So in terms of resilience, do you think that people who survive that and choose to stay are generally more resilient people? Or do you think they're born that way? I mean, I'm just curious.
I think that a lot of resilience comes from your social network. And if you don't have one, you're less resilient. And so it's very, very important to find one. Whatever form it takes.
That's really interesting because in my last conversation with my friend, she has been a 10-year survivor of a really bad kind of breast cancer. And she was diagnosed almost 10 years ago and given 6 months to live. And talk about resilience. But she, as much as she's had a community to support her to some extent, I think resilience comes from different places for different people. So for me, my community is my resilience, as you mentioned. So when I think about when something is going to happen, because it's not if, it's when. I know that I have created a community around me that will help me and support me in whatever way they can, whether it's emotional, physical, financial, whatever. I've contributed to my community enough. It's kind of like not waiting to build a network until you need them.
Yes.
I know that when you build it that way, then you definitely build in a kind of resilience into your life. I also think, though, that some people find their resilience internally. And like, for instance, in my friend's case, she said that because she was raised she had a difficult childhood. She ended up practically raising her younger siblings. She found that her resilience came from her internal sense of responsibility. So she knew that if it wasn't for her caring for her siblings, that they wouldn't be cared for. So she had this sense of responsibility, and that's what drove her to be resilient, to bounce back when things happened.
Yeah, but I think that one point that's important here is that your social network is not only who you get from, it's also who you give to. It may even be more who you give to. You know, the idea of a mother lifting a car off her toddler is because that person is important to me. That person is important enough to live for. You know, you have it so often with women in the workplace that if they have to speak up for themselves, they have no idea how to do that. But if they talk for the group, oh my, can they get resourceful?
Mm-hmm. The mama bear comes out.
And I think that you know, we shouldn't think of network just as being somebody who are willing to do something for us, but also somebody who we are willing to set time aside for.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. So it's not necessarily a separation. Those aren't contradictory in any way.
I don't see that contradictory.
So she found her resilience through her care of her network that she knew that she was responsible for.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense, because it still comes down to our relationships.
Yes.
And as humans, that is the ultimate sense of satisfaction in life, is from our relationships.
Yes.
So whether they're internal relationships within our family or the people that we're caring for, the family that we create, if it's not, you know, blood related, or our external relationships with our friends, our community, our neighbors. That makes so much sense. And I love this idea of understanding that about yourself in order to be prepared for when something happens.
I think that's, as you say, you put into the network before you need it, but it also, you don't do it just because it's an insurance policy. You do it because that's who you are.
Mm-hmm. I wonder if that's something, though, that can be taught, not as an insurance policy, but in acknowledging and in recognizing that human need. So when I think about resilience, I don't necessarily think about after the fact. I think about how we can build up our resilience before something happens.
Yeah.
So being able to work with somebody and help them develop that internal resilience in order to be able to address it when it comes, whatever trauma or difficulty that pops into their lives. I guess, and based on your experience as in organizational development, this has to apply to organizations as well, right?
I mean, be prepared is that's a good old scout advice, right? I would say that back in the 70s, when the oil crisis hit the world, and OPEC decided to show their muscles, the companies that weathered that were companies that, you know, had the unusual extra plan in the drawer. Those who had thought, what if big things happen? So yeah, To some degree, yes. The idea that, yes, it's not an if, it's a when. We don't know quite. No, this is what the whole risk management is about. We don't know exactly what's going to crash into us, but this may be a competitor. It may be the sea, right?
Right. Right. And totally out of our control, because there's just so much uncertainty that we have to find ways to be okay with it, because it's always going to be that way.
Yeah.
So tell me a story about when you moved to the U.S. You moved with children, right?
Yes.
So tell me about that. Does anything pop into your head, a specific incident, maybe having to do with your children having to figure things out?
I would say one of the first heartbreaking experiences that really drove it home for me that this was not just about my husband and me was the first year we lived here, and my parents had decided they would come over for Christmas because they wanted to see where we have moved to, and that's fine. And then I tell my son, who was 2.5 at the time, that I was, as his grandparents were coming for Christmas. And then he looks at me with his big eyes and says, "Do you think Santa can bring me a friend?"
Oh, that is so heartbreaking.
Yeah, I was like, you don't even know what to say to. Fortunately, Santa did bring him a friend.
Right. But you're so wrapped up in your own transition.
There was so many practical things to do, and even if you take your kid to the park, it's he cannot even talk to the kids well because he doesn't learn English yet. Until he has a friend, he's not going to learn English. So it's sort of a catch-22.
But I really think that builds resilience in children too. Those shifts and those transitions.
I think so too. That particularly, when it turns out all right at the end. Every time something is really rotten and turns out all right in the end, that things can be really rotten and turn out all right in the end.
Right, and that's another aspect of resilience I don't think we talk about enough. The fact that this is something that I like to talk about with some of my coaching clients who are struggling with taking risks, and they get afraid of something. And I have to say, tell me about a time when something like that happened. What actually happened? And we'll walk through it so for instance, my friend was worried about traveling somewhere. She's traveled a lot, but for some reason she was feeling a lot of anxiety about it. And I said, well, what are you really afraid of? What do you think is going to happen? And she said, well, my flight could be delayed. They could lose my luggage. And I said, have you ever been in a situation where your flight was delayed or canceled and you were kind of stranded? Has that ever happened? She said, yes. And I said, tell me about it. So she told me this story. And she was saying how she was stuck in the airport for, 6 or 8 hours. And she met this other woman and ended up playing cards with her kids, with this other woman's kids. She doesn't have children of her own. I said, that sounds like a horrible experience. It must have been so frustrating to you to be stuck for 8 hours at the airport. She goes, well, I guess it wasn't really that bad. I said, why? And she said, well, because I made this friend and I had enough food and I napped on the floor. And I said, oh, okay. So that fear isn't such a horrible fear, right? And I said, now, have you ever lost your luggage? Has that ever happened? She said, oh my gosh, yes. And, I had to go to the hotel without it. And I had to, stop at Target to get clean underwear and a toothbrush. And I was so frustrated. I said, but did they get the luggage to you? She said, yeah, the next day they got it to me. I said, oh, that sounds so horrible. That must have been a horrible, horrible experience. And she was like, no, it wasn't that bad. And I said, so what you're saying is your worst fears aren't really that bad, and that you have all this evidence that you can handle it when it happens. So when I think about what you said with your kids and them being able to get through something, things can be really bad, and then you're going to come out the other side of it a little smarter, a little wiser. and maybe even a little more compassionate for somebody else.
Yeah. And I know that for my daughter in second grade, she started in first grade right away. And in second grade, a new kid came in and she was like, he has no friends. I'm going to take care of him. So,
yes.
So, I mean, she definitely had picked up on, you cannot take people for granted. You've got to invest in them.
She probably still does that, right? Oh, yeah. As an adult?
Yes.
Yes. So I guess it comes back to when you're challenged and being able to get through it, that probably also helps build your resilience muscles.
I would say now, of course, when you're a young person, you don't have many years of experience. But the other thing that I have found again and again has been that some of the things that are really things that you don't want to be in, and if it had not happened, that would have been really great. Somewhere down the line, it may take 5 years, it may take 15 years, you're going to end up in a situation where that other person can use that exactly how that shit feels. And because you know that, you can be there. It's not a fantasy story you have to make up in your head when that person needs your presence. You just go back to, you know exactly how that may feel.
And be able to ask the right questions.
Yes. Be able to ask exactly the right questions that can set the other person free from something that's really not something they should carry.
So you're building somebody else's resilience muscles by addressing something, by remembering what you went through.
Yeah, and sort of that goes, back to what we talked about of doing this, bringing things out from the unknown or from my known but your unknown into our mutual known, which is that something that to you might have been, or in the moment, be awful, but by bringing somebody else's perspective on it, like you said with your friend, you have something awful moved into a place where you can deal with it. And sometimes it's asking the questions, or in your case, I think you're exaggerating how awful it must be to be without. But
I like to use humor.
Yeah, my son talks about the time when he was running around in his uncle's underwear because he lost his luggage. So it was way too big, and he still remembers. And now he packs extra underwear in his hand luggage. So, but the fact that this is not something that only happened to you, it happens to people that things like this happen, right? And when you get the right support, it feels seen. Then it's amazing what people can do when they feel seen.
Acknowledged.
Yes.
Yeah. You just triggered a thought for me when we talked about that structure where you're looking at things you know about yourself that other people know, things you don't know that other people might know, things like that. And we got into that things you don't know about yourself and other people don't know about you. And I was thinking about your son at 2.5 and how somebody at some point may have later on in life asked him a story about moving to the United States and what that was like for him. And he was probably too young at that time. But if they asked just the right question, it might unearth that story about hoping that Santa would bring him a friend. And then you shift that aspect of his personality, of that loneliness and understanding, and suddenly becoming more compassionate. And you unlock that story so it becomes known to both of you. That brings you to such a much closer place than if you're just sharing a story that you already know. But having somebody ask the question that draws out that subconscious story, that's the beauty of sharing stories and asking questions.
Yes. And that's why I say asking questions that use what the person has talked about.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's very easy to ask generic questions, but questions that are building on what the person talked about means that you heard what the person talked about.
Mm-hmm.
And for the acknowledgement, that is so powerful.
Mm-hmm. I think that's why that responsive listening is such a great tool. And when somebody says something and you repeat it back to them in a different phrase so that they know you were listening to them.
Yeah, or this when you said whatever you said,
this is what I heard.
Make me curious about. And that yes. And that, there are ways to do that. That's just, you see people mastering that. Oh my goodness, if they didn't teach this anywhere, they should definitely teach it everywhere.
I wish they would teach it everywhere.
They should teach it at management school. They really should teach it.
Especially in the public sector.
Yes. Well, they actually teach it at Stanford Graduate School of Business. So yes, it is being used.
Yes. It just needs to be used more and more intentionally.
Well, they should teach it in school as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, that should be right next to financial literacy. Yeah. Huh. So that's really fascinating. I totally agree that when you can share those stories and bring those unconscious or subconscious things about ourselves up into our conscious brains, like, this is why I behave this way. This is where some of my compassion came from. That you become more confident in who you are when you can bring that out to the surface, which again leads right back to this whole idea of resilience.
I was saying that I want to add, sometimes what you bring up is not what makes you more confident in, because it's something that where something positive came from, but you also know where something negative came from. So you figure out what's holding me back. What is it that, you named the fear of traveling before. There are a lot of people I have found, what is holding them back is the fear of success. Mm-hmm. It's not the fear of failure. It's the fear of what's going to happen if I am more successful than what is sort of the established norm in my circle. Because suddenly, am I going to be surrounded by sunshine friends, or will people accept me? Am I going to lose people that I care about?
Or the fear that you're going to peak in some way, and then that'll be the end, that you won't continue to grow. If I reach that level of success, is this going to be the end for me?
I think, people are a lot of people are afraid of change, and even success is a change just as well as failure can be a change. Mm-hmm. And particularly in societies where there's a focus on the family group, then, are you too good for us now? Suddenly you don't belong.
Right.
And fitting in and belonging is really not the same thing.
That's interesting too, because if you look at that and you kind of realize that that's okay, because that's not where my life is headed. And again, it comes to that sense of self, the ability to choose and bounce back and be resilient, comes to recognizing what's good for you and what you really want in your life. And so that change, you have to kind of decide, is it worth the risk of losing that particular social circle?
Yeah. But if the social circle is your family, then that's a big risk. And I have met people who have, they don't have nice coming home reunions with their families because they're extended family are suspicious of them.
Mm-hmm.
And they have chosen careers where they can stay away because it hurts too much not being accepted as a successful professional person.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's sad. Yes. And your primary reaction to it was very American in that, of course, we can walk our own path, but that's not really the way the rest of the world works.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
I've heard that before, that's a very American concept.
It is. And, whole South America and Asia and big parts of Europe, your family is your number one, and you do have an obligation.
Right.
So,
right. And you don't chart your own path.
Well,
in general,
you should not take too big steps.
Right. Right. I find that fascinating. It's just such a completely different culture. And
it is.
And it comes back down to when you travel, seeing what else is out there and seeing that subconscious or unconscious bias. I look at that and think, oh, that's so sad. But they look at me and think, oh, that's so sad. She lives so far from her family.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That's really fascinating how we attach a value to that cultural norm.
Oh, yes.
Like something good versus something bad.
I think that it may not be the norm itself. It's like, if you can do whatever you're doing and your family say, oh, good for you, then it doesn't carry the price, right?
Right. Mm. Yeah, it all comes down to your choice of what you want in your life and whether you're willing to take the risk to get there.
Yeah.
And we are seeing that more in other parts of the country now than we ever have before. I'm seeing a lot of my friends from India moving to the US and taking that leap and charting their own path. And generally, I've seen some that came by themselves and then their families they don't understand. They cannot wrap their heads around why their child would want to move to the United States and stay here and not be part of their family. They just can't wrap their heads around it. But I've also seen the other answer, because our global communication has changed our structure so dramatically, that I'm seeing lots of people moving from India and then their parents coming and staying a couple months at a time and then going back, and they go out there and spend a couple months at a time. So they keep that family relationship. And it's become more acceptable in some cases than I think it ever was before.
I think that if you are the person who's responsible for your parents in cultures where you are responsible for your parents, we have Social Security and 401ks and whatever we have in this country. So there is a system in which, as a child, the law doesn't say that you're responsible for your children, but you're not responsible for your parents. And I'm sure the law doesn't say anything either, but norms are so strong. And if you have that kind of norms, because that is your elder care,
right,
then it's very egoistic to move away. That means I'm not going to take care of you. You better have 7 siblings,
Yes, which I think with the families that I'm thinking of, that I know, that's really the case, is that they have multiple siblings that stayed. So they were given that opportunity and accepted.
You can always, not always, but you can very often in the language figure out whether they are social obligations, because if you have different words for the number 1 son and the number 2 son, and what kind of relationships you have on the paternal and maternal side of the family, then you probably have obligations that follow a different path as well.
Yeah. We just don't see that in the US. It's such a different structure.
I think part of the reason is that it's built into the whole being of the United States that people moved away to come here.
Mm-hmm.
So it's founded on cords that were cut.
That sense of independence and fierce independence.
Well, for a lot of the founding families, it has been either they came as a group because the whole village moved, or it has been people who were okay with letting go of the family, right?
Mm-hmm. What's interesting though is that I've noticed in different parts of the U.S. that is different as well. So, for instance, there are families in Montana that homesteaded here, a couple hundred years ago, and their families have stayed, and their children may leave to go to school and start a career, but a lot of them come back. We have multi-generations of families living near each other or within a reasonable drive of each other, where when I was in Colorado as a high schooler, I didn't see that as much. You didn't see generations of families living in Colorado Springs together. And I definitely didn't see that in the Washington, D.C. area when I lived there. And I didn't even see it in Brisbane, Australia when I was there. They didn't have multi-generations of families that stayed, that were born and raised in the same place where their children stayed and their grandchildren stayed. But in Montana, I actually see that more. It's a totally different culture.
Yeah. I must say that I was back for a high school reunion last summer, and I was surprised how many of my school friends who were there because the school was still just around the corner. I think that that there are people who move around and they find each other because they're comfortable with strangers and
Well, and again, it comes right back to the whole theme of resilience. And I do find that people who travel, people who are who take risks and struggle in a different way from the struggle that you would have by staying where you are. Not that people don't struggle. I can tell you here in Montana, especially ranchers, anyone in the ag industry, they have serious struggle and they are resilient in that respect.
Find that I have been through a lot by moving, but my God, I've been saved for a lot by not staying as well. And I take my hat off for my sister who does all the hard work back home.
Mm-hmm.
When you have aging parents, that's not a small thing. And that requires resilience if ever I saw one.
Oh, definitely. My sister helped care for my father when he was dying, and she was the only one that was nearby. So I have a lot of respect and appreciation for that struggle because she saw things that I didn't have to see.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. It's definitely different kinds of struggle. Well, Charlotte, let's end with one more story. I keep coming back to your being an expat, moving away from your family and your home with kids and not knowing what to expect. And I know I have lots of stories from the different times that I moved across the country or when I traveled to Europe and things that were striking to me that really gave me a clue about my strength and my resilience that I didn't necessarily know I had.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm curious if you had an event or something specific that made you realize I can do this. I've got this.
I will tell you another story from the life of my kids, which was that one summer we decided to send them home without us to visit the grandparents so that they could have time with their grandparents without their parents, because we sort of felt we robbed them of that by moving so far away. So they were doing a trip with Icelandic Air, which Reykjavik is a very small airport. You can't get lost in Reykjavik. So they were old enough not to have to be escorted because the oldest was old enough. And then you may not be lost, but the plane may not be there when you get to Reykjavik. So we had some frantic calls at odd hours because they were doing this transfer, and there were nobody to, there were not no planes for Copenhagen from Reykjavik at the time. So that was stressful. Eventually they ended up in Reykjavik, ended in Copenhagen, and everything went well. But, later my daughter moved to Italy for half a year, most of a year. And let's just say that was considerably more stressful than going through Reykjavik. But I'm not sure she had been up to it if she had not been through, taking care of her brother through.
And having to be resourceful.
Yes, and figuring out that other people were friendly and helpful, and you could just ask somebody who spoke either of your languages, and they would look after you.
Mm-hmm. So I can imagine, did she call you when they got to Reykjavik and realize that their flight wasn't there? How did that happen? How did you get alerted?
Well, they had brought our Danish telephone with them, so they just called us from the airport, and it was not a big crisis, except you could really hear in her voice that this was not funny. I can totally respect that. If you're a 14-year-old or something like that, that's not really where you want to be all there by yourself.
Were you laughing when she called?
No, we're trying to calm her down, and then people around her heard that she was not happy, and then they helped her. So
that is definitely a moment when you have to put your kids on an airplane.
Yeah,
and work your way through something like that.
I have been called negative things as a parent a lot of times, and this was probably one of them. But there was a Danish woman 10 years ago who was arrested in New York for putting her baby in a pram outside the window of the bar, and that was child endangerment. Ooh. And that's what everybody back home do. So,
Oh, gosh.
Yeah. So, my kids would go visiting their parents, and that's just like half a mile down the road. Who cares? They would just go and visit them.
Right.
When they were 3 and 5.
Well, our neighborhood was like that. It's still like that to a certain extent. When our boys were little, they were able to walk over to their best friend's house, which is, 4 blocks away. And we live right across the street from an elementary school. So they were allowed to play on that playground without an adult supervising all the time. But it's different putting them on a plane.
Right?
Well, certainly when they would get a mouthful of dirt from falling down and come home. And I definitely see that as being part of why they're resilient now. Is I wasn't always hovering over them. They did get hurt. They had to find ways to find a Band-Aid or have one brother bring the other brother home because he had a skinned knee. They knew how to clean up a cut if I wasn't home. They could clean it and put a Band-Aid on. And that's kind of a sad thing that I see, is that there are a lot of kids that don't know how to take care of themselves. They don't have the resources because their parents hover and don't give them the opportunity to make mistakes and get hurt once in a while. And I will never forget when our first was born. We lived in Washington, D.C. And he got sick. He had a fever for a couple days, and he was only 4 to 6 weeks old. And I remember really starting to panic. And I'm a pretty low maintenance mom, and my husband and I were both kind of just dealing with it and, feeding him. And I called my mom, who's a nurse, and we were able to give him a little bit of infant Tylenol to get the fever down. But after 2 days, when he was still feverish, I decided we need to just take him to the doctor. So I made an appointment, and we were just a few blocks away. So I put him in the stroller, and my husband and I walked him over to the appointment. Dr. Kleiner put him on the bedside and went to take off his diaper to, check, make sure his body was normal. There weren't any rashes or whatever. And that was the first time in 3 days that I saw Jacob smile, because he had been so sick. And Dr. Kleiner said, well, he looks okay to me. And of course, my husband and I were a little upset because we said, he has been so sick for the last 2 days. And my husband said, what do we look for? Like, how do we know when it's time to take him to the doctor versus, letting it run its course? And doctor said, you look for a sick kid. And, it was one of those aha moments for us. But the next thing out of his mouth, he said, look, if your kid never falls off the bed, you are too protective.
Mm-hmm.
And that to me was kind of how we decided to raise our children, which is to allow them to fall sometimes.
Yeah.
And it may be inconvenient, but this is part of how they will build those resilience muscles, like we've been talking about through this whole theme. Yeah. So putting them on the plane, I would say you're a good mom. So don't listen to anyone else.
Thank you. Much appreciated.
Thank you, Charlotte, for chatting with me about this. This is really meaningful. And I think it's so important for people to hear all the different perspectives on what makes somebody resilient and how we can prepare for whatever is going to happen, which we can't necessarily. But as long as we give ourselves evidence that we can handle it by addressing these things, these fears that we have, and making it through difficult times, we can all be resilient.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to Your Stories Don't Define You, How You Share Them Will. Please visit my website for more podcast episodes, blog posts, and information about how I can help you develop and share your stories at elkinsconsulting.com.